present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly. Wow. In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Folks, it's time for us to take back control of our government now before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, and our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back. And this program is just about that. Today we are pleased and honored to have Mr. Leo Hohmann with us. Mr. Hohmann is the news editor for WND Books and author of the book Stealth Invasion, Muslim Conquest Through Immigration and Resettlement Jihad. During our live broadcast, we invite you to call in with your questions and comments. 646, do we have that number live, by the way? 646-652-4620. That's 646-652-4620. And please press the 1 button if you wish to break in and join in that conversation. Leo, welcome to Liberty Talk Radio.
Thanks for having me on today, Joe.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the technical glitches. We don't know where it is, you know. We'd love to blame you for that, but we won't because you're our guest, okay? You know, Leo, when it comes to immigration, there is generally the general subject of immigration. I find that subject brings in more misconceptions, more fear-mongering, more prejudice than you can shake a stick at. When it comes to the immigration of people from the Middle East into America, it magnifies itself severalfold. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm confused as well. Why do we have this problem with immigrants? It costs a lot of money to come over here. I know if I want to take a trip to Europe, you know, I have to save my pennies before I do that, and it takes a long time and whatever. And yet we have this mass immigration. Are all these people a lot wealthier than I'll ever be so they can make this trip?
Well, the truth is, Joe, they're coming here on your dime, my dime and your dime, the American taxpayer. And regardless of what we hear in the media about a humanitarian crisis, this has been planned for years. And what we're seeing is a historic migration out of the Middle East and into Western democracies in Europe, Canada, the United States, at unprecedented levels from the Middle East. And unfortunately, a lot of these people who are coming, you know, a lot are in desperate situations and in need of a break in life. But by the same token, we're also seeing many coming into Europe and in the United States who wish to do us harm. And, you know, we have, I recently wrote a story for WorldNet Daily about a week ago that documented 8 bloody terrorist attacks in 18 months, a little bit less than 18 months here on U.S. soil. And the one thing that every one of them had in common was that they were carried out by either a Muslim immigrant or the son of a Muslim immigrant. So we're paying the price. We're paying the price in the cost of lives and blood and lost limbs and a lot of heartache.
Well, why is constitutionally, how does the government take my money and give it to people to immigrate here? I mean, when my father came here, he came here with not a penny in his pocket, was on a freighter of some sort, came here, didn't speak the English, had no money whatsoever, and it was, I mean, he was here on his own dime, and
right.
If he ate, it was on his own dime. So why is the government allocating not but citizens' funds to import people from the Middle East? Why we do that in the first place?
Well, it takes us back to the United Nations and the 2030 agenda. Are you at all familiar with this document? It was approved last September by more than 100 world leaders in New York City at the United Nations, led by President Obama. And in this document, which is a sort of update, it's an update of the Agenda 21 document, For the first time, we see the UN talking about the international human rights of migrants. And these migrants, they say, have a right to migrate to more wealthy countries. And it used to be that the definition of a refugee was somebody who was being forced out of their home and to leave their country because of their political belief or their religious belief, some sort of persecution based on what they believed. Well, that's not the case anymore with the new redefinition of refugees by the United Nations. These are people that could be just fleeing because they're seeking a better economic opportunity. And it's you and I who are going to pay for that. It's basically a redistribution of the wealth plan by the United Nations. And we see globalist politicians in the United States like President Obama and Hillary Clinton, and in the EU like Angela Merkel in Germany, buying into this globalist concept of accepting the third world into our country, and thereby that's a method thereby to redistribute the wealth. So we see the poor people coming into our country so they can live a better life on welfare, and we see our better paying jobs shipped over to the third world for those that haven't left. And it's a double whammy, and this is what people are reacting against when they elect people like Donald Trump, but the globalists just don't get it.
Well, I mean, if I didn't know better, I'd say, well, come back when you're sober. Because what you're saying, that I know it's true, but it makes no sense. Since when does the President of the United States have legislative powers? That's up to the Congress and the Senate to make those laws and those agreements. And the President can either approve it or can veto it. Now, are you saying that the President is bypassing the legislative portion of our government, as well as the judicial part of our government, and making unilateral individual agreements with a world body that the individual taxpayer has to pony up to? Am I correct, or do I have this all screwed up?
No, I think you're on to a lot of it right there, but there is a very nefarious law that was passed in 1980 called the Refugee Act of 1980 that gives almost all the power over the refugee program to the inhabitant of the White House, the presidency, and Congress. Their only role really is to fund it, and they could pull the rug out. Congress could if they defunded it, but we've never had a Congress yet in 35 years that has defunded this program. In fact, it just keeps growing. So,
well, what I don't say is I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. I get so upset at this subject. Well, we lost him. Oh, there you go. We hear a lot about jihad, about immigrants coming in, but we don't hear from these politicians that it's our fault. We are the ones that we agreed to give the president unilateral power to bring everyone in at the taxpayer expense. Why aren't they screaming about that? Why do I have to scream about that?
Well, we have a two-party system in this country, and the Democrats, they see these incoming refugees as part of their voting bloc. It creates a new, what they call, oppressed minority. As you know, the Democrats search out oppressed minorities because those are their most consistent voting blocs.
Right.
And so we can understand why the Democrats would want to bring in people from Somalia and Afghanistan and Iraq, because it makes sense that they would want to expand their voting bloc. More perplexing is why the Republican Party would want to bring in these heavy welfare users from the Middle East. And by the way, 90% of refugees from the Middle East are on some form of welfare, usually food stamps, but other forms like Medicaid. I think 70% are on Medicaid and 89 to 90% are on food stamps. But if you think about it, the Republican globalists, the Bushes and those types, and the McCains and even Paul Ryan, they are for pretty much open borders as well as the Democrats. And what do they get out of the deal? They see it as cheap labor, what they call labor mobility, to move freely and openly across open borders. This is just a concept that globalists have totally bought into, and their eventual goal is to create regions like the EU. They want to create a North American Union with Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which would have no borders, and as well as have similar blocks across the world like this in regional government. So what I have found and what I include in my book, Joe, is we have what I call an unholy alliance between the Islamists and the globalists. And if you think about it, at first it makes no sense. Why would a secular leftist globalist want to join forces with an Islamist?
Right.
Well, if you think about it, they're both after the same thing, which is world hegemony, global power. The Islamists want to create a global caliphate and rule under the precepts of Sharia law, and the secular globalists want to create global governance and global government where they would control the world in a sort of, global socialist superstate based on the principles of technocracy. So if you look at the fact that they both want the same thing, which is control of the world, and then you look at, well, what are the major obstacles to them creating a caliphate or creating a global socialist superstate? There are two things. Christianity is one, and the other is the nation state. Christianity is where we get our family values, our social cohesion, our common values. The nation state is what holds us together with certain constitutional values. And so we see both of these groups warring against the nation state and against Christianity. And how do you destroy it? You bring in people who don't share those values. You bring in people from Sharia-compliant, hostile countries like Afghanistan and Somalia. And then you see what? Terrorist attacks. You see then the need for more control. Because we have so many terrorist attacks, the government has to start, increasing security and listening to our phone calls and, taking more control. It's the vicious cycle.
Well, actually, open borders is only a part of the problem. But when you start paying people to come here and then to go on the public dole, that's beyond open borders. Excuse me. Oh boy. Excuse me. But because I don't have a problem with, well, it depends on what your definition of open borders are, but I don't have problem with people who want to come here and save up for years for the boat ride or the plane ride or whatever to bring their family here. And then they come here and they want to assimilate. I have no problem with that.
Right.
I have a problem with
I don't either.
I have a problem with this wholesale, bring them in. I saw a program recently of Dearborn, Michigan, where they took a ride around Dearborn, I think it was Dearborn, Michigan, and you would not know you were in the United States. There was not one American flag flying. Many of the buildings were of Middle Eastern, architecture. It was like a foreign city. Didn't look like any American city that you've ever seen before. And they drove around for miles, and it was all this way. And it was just basically has become an Islamic city. When Dearborn, Michigan used to be the industrial seat of the world, the free market industrial seat of the world. And now it's an Islamic enclave. And I don't know where this is going. I don't think it's going to end well. It just seems that it's not very well thought out, the way it's been constructed and the way it's going. And
it's not well thought out unless your goal was to destroy a nation state. And I believe, in my opinion, that is what we see going on. When we see a drive through Dearborn, Michigan, and it looks like another country, and we see terrorist attacks going on at malls in Minnesota and at Ohio State University, that creates fear in the population. It creates division in the population. It gnaws at your social cohesion. It destroys what we are as a nation. and it destroys our concept of who we are as a nation. It starts us warring against each other. It creates chaos, and all of these things seem to play into the hands of these people who want to destroy America so they can replace it with something else.
Well, where are all of our senators and congressmen? Look at Rand Paul, for example. Why aren't they screaming every single day on CNN?
Rand Paul, his hometown of Bowling Green, Kentucky, has been inundated with Middle Eastern refugees from Somalia and elsewhere over the last 10 years. He was at one point very outspoken about it, but a few years back he suddenly shut up and stopped saying anything more about it. And so, whether what happened with Rand Paul, I cannot say, other than the fact that he knows firsthand what's going on from his own hometown in Bowling Green, and he says very little about it anymore.
Well, Donald Trump hasn't said much specifically about it. I mean, he talks in platitudes, but he doesn't talk with any specificity. He doesn't say, here is an agreement that needs to be discontinued, null and voided, right, because this is what it's doing. We will allow people to come in. If they come to our shores, they want to apply for it, etc. We'll give them a visa for so many days. All that. But he's not talking that. He talks in platitudes, so I don't think the populace understands what the real problem is. He's playing on more emotion than he is on logic.
Well, he did say one really good thing, but then he had since backtracked on it. When he said we needed to halt all Muslim immigration until we can, quote, figure out what the hell is going on. And I thought that was the correct response, because this refugee program has been flying under the radar for 35 years with very little congressional oversight. They just throw money at it, and they don't really look at the effect it's having on our cities and our states. And there's been some calls in Congress by Brian Babin out of Texas, for instance, to do the same thing, to call a moratorium on any more of these refugees and to audit the whole program and find out exactly what it's costing us and what are the effects.
Why has not one person in Congress brought impeachment against Barack Obama for doing this?
I think they were afraid of being called a racist. The Democrats did a very good job of painting a picture of anyone who was critical of President Obama. Well, it was just, you're a racist.
A racist, okay, yeah, I can see that. Unfortunately, I can understand that, and that just hacks me off. Well, I think if you ask the man on the street, or the woman on the street, excuse me, Sally, or the woman on the street, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave you gals out, ask them to describe the problem that we're having with immigration, they wouldn't be familiar with any of what you just told me. They would just say, oh, these people are coming in, how they get there, they don't know, they're causing problems, something should be done, and we shouldn't allow them in anymore. I mean, that's basically what you get. We never get the facts, we only get the hype.
Well, that's why I wrote this book, exactly. The book really attempts to connect a lot of the dots, and that's what the problem is in the media. Every time we have one of these terrorist attacks, for instance, if you look at this list on my sheet of 8 over a period of just 18 months, whenever there is a new one, like the most recent one was at Ohio State University, where a student started ramming his vehicle into a crowd of students and then got out and started stabbing them. Well, the reporting on that story did not put in context the fact that we had 7 other similar attacks in 18 months. And, just 2 months previously, there was an almost identical attack in September at the Crossroads Mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where a Somali refugee, just like it was a Somali refugee in Ohio State, well, it was a Somali refugee 2 months prior in Minnesota who did a stabbing attack in a mall. And we had a stabbing attack in the same city of Columbus, Ohio in February at a restaurant, and we had the San Bernardino attack, the Orlando attack, the UC Merced attack, the Chattanooga attack, all of the Boston bombing, if you go a little bit further back, and every single one of these, as I said, was carried out by an Islamic migrant or the son of an Islamic migrant. but they don't connect the dots. Each event is reported in a vacuum as if it's an isolated incident.
Right.
So
Well,
the American citizen remains ignorant.
are the people who are, how are they selected to come here? I mean, I'm sure there are millions of people in the Middle East living in horrid conditions that would cut off their right arm to get a free trip to the United States. So they're not all coming. There's probably only a certain percentage. I don't know what the formula is, but how do they select that group, that small percentage? And then once they select them, how do they qualify them? You know, as to being someone who wants to come here for, to maintain independence, freedom, you know, go into business, or you know, a better life for their family, etc., versus coming here because I want to blow up Yankee Stadium.
That is a very, very good question that you just asked, Joe, because nobody knows exactly the process. But what we do know is very disturbing. 95% of the refugees that are coming here to the United States at a rate of over 100,000 per year are selected by the United Nations. Okay? So do we want to trust the United Nations to pick our refugees that are coming to this country? Most Americans, I think, would say no.
Absolutely,
but that's who's doing it, and it's very disturbing. Once the UN makes the initial selection of refugees, then our Homeland Security Department puts them through a screening process.
Oh yeah, and they're noted to be very accurate, by the way, very thorough. We all know that.
Right. How do you screen somebody who says they're from Syria? You know, when we know for a fact that there's no law enforcement data available to us from Syria, and we know for a fact that you can buy a Syrian passport on the black market for as little as $100, and we have no idea who these people are who are showing up at UN refugee camps saying they're from Syria, and then ending up in a Western country like Germany or France or the United States or Canada. And it's just a fraudulent system that needs to be completely overhauled. And you're right, Donald Trump needs to do more than utter, vague platitudes about this.
Well, how about we get rid of everyone in Congress, and then everyone in the Senate, impeach them all, throw out everyone, and yet we have all these clowns. I don't even call them officials or public service. They're clowns. Every one of them are clowns. They're all on the take. They're all bums, as far as I'm concerned. I'm very prejudiced right now. We have all these people, and no one's screaming. It's not that we have 2 or 3 people in government and they're not talking. We have thousands of highly paid, purportedly very intelligent, knowledgeable people of what is going on in the world, and no one says anything. And I'm angry because it's sucking out billions of dollars of the taxpayer money, not only for the programs, for their salaries, and they talk as if everything is fine and all they have to do is fine-tune this or that and everything is going to be great. Just keep the money rolling. Now, how do we afford this program when we are $20 trillion in current year's debt and as high as $250 quadrillion in our unfunded debt? How do we afford this? I mean, buy me a new car, please. I want a Corvette with the big engine.
It's insane, Joe. It's completely insane. A better question yet is, what I said, the word I used, fraudulent, is a pretty strong term. But let's take the example of one country, Somalia. Somalia had a brutal civil war back in 1991, okay? 1991. My children weren't even born yet in 1991, and I was, just 10 years out of college, out of high school. And they're still coming, Joe. All these years later, we're still bringing Somalis here as refugees at a rate of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 per year. There was 9,000, more than 9,000 came last year from Somalia, and they're currently at another rate of 10,000 so far this year. And to illustrate just how fraudulent this program is, there is a woman, a Somali refugee, who lives in Minnesota and was recently elected to the Minnesota State Legislature. I can't pronounce her name, so I won't even try it here on the air. But this woman is the first Somali female refugee to be elected to a statewide public office in the country, I believe. Anyway, she recently went back to Somalia in recent weeks to visit friends and family, and I've been talking to a friend of mine, Philip Haney, who's a retired Homeland Security screening officer. He actually screens Somalis for a living, Somali refugees. That's what he did until he retired last year and wrote a book called See Something, Say Nothing. It's a whistleblower book you may have heard about on how foolhardy our government is and the lack of real screening that's going on. Anyway, he told me that this is commonplace for Somali refugees living in Minnesota to do. They often leave back home for Somalia in the harshest winter months because it's too cold in Minnesota for them to bear, so they go back home to Somalia for the winter, and then they come back to Minnesota when it gets warm again in the spring. Now, what does that tell you? Are they really a refugee fleeing war and oppression if they're able to go back home every year to winter in their homeland because it's too cold in Minnesota? I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. If they're not really refugees.
Right. Well, how do you afford to go back and forth? I avoid going on vacation because these days it's so expensive.
Yeah,
and
right.
I can afford to go when I don't go because it's a foolhardy thing to do.
But the only issue I was addressing is, how do you call them a refugee?
No, I agree with you. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to downplay what you were saying. I'm just saying that you're absolutely correct. But if they are refugees, they come here. They can't afford to take the bus to the other side of town. How do they get the money to go back overseas? I mean, none of this makes any sense.
I don't know. A lot of them do have jobs, believe it or not, but they're being employed like in meatpacking factories and other sorts of low-wage jobs, and they have huge families, Joe. I'm talking 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids per family. And so a job at the local meatpacking plant is not going to cover their expenses. So what happens? Yeah. They have to augment their income with food stamps and Medicaid.
Well, you better get a part-time job. Pay for all this, because I don't want to pay for it.
No, we're subsidizing.
I know
subsidizing their lifestyle.
But I would prefer you get the part-time job and then take the subsidy off my shoulders. I don't want to pay for it anymore. If you know how angry I was right now, you'd probably hang up on me. This angers the heck out of me because the whole system is so corrupt. Now, I'm going to change the dialogue a little bit. In a sense, are the Western countries somewhat to blame for the underlying mood of the people in the Middle East? Let's look at Palestine. Now it's called Israel, for example. Let's look at Iraq. Iraq was formed by, I think the British drew the lines for Iraq as to who was going to be Iraqi and who was not. In other words, the Western powers have interfered unjustifiably in the Middle East for decades, telling countries what they're part of, what they're not part of, what they can do, what they can't do, and also exploited their natural resources and subjugated many of the people in the Middle East. Now, that's historic. I mean, we can argue that a little bit, but basically, it was always the Western powers subjugating the Middle East powers to second-class citizenry. Is this not blowback? Should we not be blaming ourselves? When I say ourselves, should the Western nations should not be blaming themselves for being such taking such an attitude, a conquering attitude toward the Middle East, exploiting them at the same time?
I do have a section in my book where I point out how every Middle Eastern war since the days of Ronald Reagan, when we were fighting the Soviets, remember, in Afghanistan,
Right.
We had a proxy war, going on there. Starting with that war, up until the most recent war in Iraq, and another war in Afghanistan, and now then the Syrian civil war, you could say that was stoked, if not started, by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton when we started interfering there and supplying the Sunni rebels with weapons to war against the secular dictator there, Assad. We took out the secular dictator in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and that blew up in our face. So all of these wars, as I point out in the book, have led to more refugees, and more refugees coming to the United States. Even this started under Ronald Reagan. He called the Afghan Sunni Islamic Sharia-compliant Islamists, what did he call them? He called them freedom fighters, and he brought some of them here to the United States. In his mind, they were freedom fighters because they were fighting the Soviets. And then we took out Saddam, and, the other untold story, when we took out Saddam Hussein, we unleashed hell's fury on the Christians of Iraq. That is a story that has not been reported. It started immediately upon the overthrow of Saddam in 2003. Both the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims started burning churches, kidnapping pastors, killing pastors, taking sex slaves from the female Christian population, and the same thing happened in Syria, okay, and with ISIS. And basically, ISIS was just a outgrowth of Al Qaeda, became ISIS at some point, and it's on and on. So yes, the Western powers do bear some of the responsibility for this. You're exactly right. However, I also believe, I may differ a little bit with you on this. I'm not so sure that. Even if the Western powers haven't been making a lot of mistakes, and you can argue whether it's a mistake or it's intentional, I'm still not so sure that, if we have Islamists in control, meaning religious Muslims, devoutly religious Muslims, not secular Muslims like Saddam or Assad in Syria, if we have religious Muslims in power in these countries, we always see persecution against Christians and death in the wake, left in the wake, and it's very brutal, and it's very hard to live under those types of regimes.
Let me agree with you. I guess I always look at things from sort of a human nature point of view. If in fact, and I know we would never do this, we will do this when we finally collapse as a nation, which probably is not too far from now. In that, if we have a severe currency collapse or trading, something happens, and we're going to be forced to stop all this. But if we did voluntarily, removed all of our bases, removed all of our soldiers, removed everything out of these countries. Now, obviously there would be persecutions, there would be internal strife, wars, etc. So this correction, but it would be in the absence of us, and I'm assuming also that under this scenario, that the Western nations, Britain, France, Germany, etc., would also remove themselves and leave them alone. There would be internal strife, but it would be what happens when a foreign power leaves. You have internal conflict. Then you have the leftists in that country, or the rightists, or whatever you want to call them. Then they fight. So let them kill each other rather than killing us because we're interfering with their country. And I think naturally what will happen is that there will be a lot of conflict within those nations, but we won't be involved. We shouldn't be involved at all. We should shut the curtain and say, I don't want to look. It's none of our business. It's their business. But we have interfered with every one of those countries in every one way, shape, or form. And this is all blowback as far as I'm concerned, and especially when you have a globalist president that's agreeing to things that make it were basically unconstitutional, we've got a problem, Houston. We're a hell of a problem.
The real problem that we've seen, and I will reiterate this, is that President Obama has been working diligently for 8 years, secular dictators in these countries with Islamic extremists. We've seen he tried to do it in Egypt, but it backfired there with the Muslim Brotherhood. Mr. Morsi was put in power with the help of Obama. And then he was thrown out by the military, as you recall, and al-Sisi is now in power. They were lucky to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood candidate there, but that was in spite of Obama. He did it he's done it in Libya. They got rid of Gaddafi, and that country is devolved into chaos now with religious extremists killing people. It's going on in Syria. But in Syria, we ran into what? Mr. Putin, who decided to back the Assad, the secular dictator. So, again, Obama was thwarted. But he was trying to get a religious extremist Muslim government in power in each one of these countries. And if that happens, I'm telling you, it will be wholesale slaughter of Christians. And this Middle East region, you know, as recently as 100 years ago, excuse me, I've got some laryngitis, but as recently as 100 years ago, the Middle East was predominantly Christian, okay? But the more that, and the West has intervened, you're correct, but guess what? They've backed the wrong people in these countries. They've backed the extremist Muslim radicals who have been, when they get in power, it's wholesale slaughter of Jews and Christians.
Yeah, but I don't understand this. We hear more about problems with immigration and related issues than we do about problems that are occurring right in our cities and our states here in America. It's like we have no problems at all. We don't even exist. But I tell you, you know what's happening in Libya? I don't care what's happening. No, I shouldn't say, when I say I don't care, I mean I do care. I don't want anyone to get hurt. But that's none of my concern. My concern should be what's happening in my city, on my block, in my neighborhood. That's what I should be concerned about. And the government should keep its nose out of even my neighborhood in the United States. And this drives me nuts when we hear them talking about, well, we have to speak to these people, and we have to speak to these people, and we have to move troops here. Where is this in the Constitution? None of this is in fact, it's all anti-constitutional. Why am I the only person? Why am I the only smart person on the block? Why isn't everyone screaming in Congress what I'm doing? Why?
Well, you know, a lot of these problems that we're having in our cities with crime and terrorism and overcost burdens are being imported because of we're bringing the problems of the Middle East and North Africa and other places. We're bringing those problems here into our cities.
Well,
through the immigration program.
You know, I've come to the conclusion whenever our country has a problem, if you want to find out the root of the problem, look at the government. And you'll find once you backtrack it, it was because of some government program that when you look at it rationally is ignorant of the facts and ignorant of the Constitution and disrespectful to everyone who's making an honest living. Everything from our school system to the welfare programs to Obamacare to the healthcare system to bases around the world. You know, we have aircraft. You know, it just hacks me. I'm sorry for ranting, but it hacks me off that we can have 13 or 14 aircraft carriers, you know, that cost hundreds of billions of dollars to keep in the water in places like the China Sea, the Persian Gulf. But God forbid a Russian frigate or something goes out of their boundaries, you know, it's World War III. I mean, why do we consider ourselves to be the only ones to do whatever the heck we want to do, screw everybody, but no one else should do it, you know, because then they're aggressors. I don't understand this country. If you read a history book from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and try to compare it to where you're living now, you are talking different planets. Forget about different countries altogether.
I agree. It's gone insane. It definitely has gone insane. But you have to look again at the end goal of these two groups. They want to do away with borders, do away with boundaries, create a global government. And how do you do that? You have to create a new order, and you can't create a new global order unless you delegitimize and destroy the existing one.
Right.
And that's why we're seeing these enemies of the United States being imported by the thousands every year secretly into our cities and towns. These people are being sent, Joe, not just to New York and L.A. and Chicago. They're being sent to over 300 cities and towns. I'm talking small cities like Owensboro, Kentucky, and Wilmar, Minnesota, and, Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, Georgia has gotten more Syrian refugees than New York City.
Are there any good stories to tell? Are there?
I'm sure there are.
mean, where they assimilated, they're good citizens, they meld in just beautifully, like I meld into every group. Everyone loves me. That's why I have no problem, But,
I
all right,
you,
Sally.
Joe.
All right, Sally. Stop coughing. That's a fake cough. But we hear about the horror stories, but are they the exception, or is the exception those that are assimilating well?
I think excuse me. There are a lot of stories of those who have come here and assimilated well. But it only takes, if I give you 10 pieces of candy and I tell you that 2 of them are poisonous, are you going to eat all 10 of those?
Well, I love candy. I probably would. Only kidding. No, I throw all 10 away.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of the scenario that we're dealing with the refugees. 80% of them 80 or 90% of them are probably never going to cause us harm. Now,
right.
They could cause us a financial burden,
right?
As we talked about earlier with the Medicaid and the food stamps and the subsidized housing and right down the list. But most of them are not going to do us violence against us. But it only takes 5 or 10% and we're in deep trouble. And we're seeing that happening now with the stabbing attacks in Minnesota and Ohio State and San Bernardino and Chattanooga, that boy. And the other thing is, how do you vet these people? The Chattanooga shooter came here at the age of 6. His name was Mohammed Abdul Aziz. He came here at the age of 6. He went to our schools. He graduated high school, one of the most popular kids in his class. He was on the wrestling team. He had good grades. He went to college at the University of Chattanooga, at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and got him an engineering degree. Now, by all appearances, that was a fully assimilated success story.
Right.
Am I correct?
Right, absolutely.
Well, guess what happens after he graduates from college at about the age of 23, 24, he starts growing out his beard. He starts studying the Quran more intensely. He starts going to mosque more regularly. He starts discovering his roots overseas, his family roots that his parents left behind. And he becomes, quote unquote, radicalized. It all happened in a matter of months. It doesn't take long. And so this is what we're up against. People who are being brought here from a culture that doesn't mix with ours, and even though they can, for a time, become westernized and assimilate into our societies. Everybody who the press talked to about this kid said, oh, he was the nicest young man you'd ever want to meet. And the same thing was said about the St. Cloud stabbing guy and the Ohio State student. The pattern is clear. They were all wonderful people until they at some point became more devout and started studying the Quran.
Yeah.
And that is where the problem lies. The problem lies in the Islamic texts.
Well, let me ask you this. What if, and I know that there's no answer to this question, but I just want your opinion. What if the United States was an isolationist relative to the subject that we're talking about? In other words, we mind our own business, we allow people to free trade, and we don't bomb anyone. They want to kill each other, that go girl go, type thing. Do you think that these people, there's a less of a chance that these people would have been radicalized, or they radicalized partially or in whole because they see the damage that the Western countries are doing to their own country and their own religion?
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
The problem lies in the Islamic texts and the example that was set for them by their prophet Muhammad. It has been a religion, and that is the highest model for any Muslim, is to emulate the life of Muhammad. And when you get into these texts of the Quran and the Hadiths and you start studying Muhammad and what his life was all about, it was all about slaughter. Slaughter the Jews, slaughter the Christians, slaughter anyone who does not accept Islam. And so that is the problem. Now, I'm not saying that there are not peaceful Muslims. There are. But typically, your peaceful Muslims are the ones who are more secular and more moderate, and they're not taking the Quran word. They're not in every day studying the Quran and how they can become more like Muhammad.
Okay. Now, we only have a few more minutes. All right. Where do we go from here? What is going to happen? And let me give you one scenario. We're approaching a debt crisis, and now I'm a closet economist and a financial guy. I'm a commodities guy. All right, so I'm not an expert, but I know enough about it to feel uncomfortable. And many people I have on my show are the quintessential world experts in this regard, not only in economics, but in finance, international finance, especially as it relates to commodities, all right? And when I say commodities, I mean anything from zinc to platinum. But if we have an economic, I should say collapse in a way, not a slowdown. We already had a slowdown. The next time. How do you see, and by the way, we will not be able to afford to pay Social Security checks and stuff like that, or we will pay it, but a loaf of bread will cost you $23.40, so, good luck with your Social Security check. Do you see where we are going as a nation, irrespective of what's happening with the people of the Middle East, as a catalyst to dismember the attitude that we have to take these people in? Do you see a change of reverting back to what our Constitution originally said, or do you see it getting worse even though we can't afford it? I mean, how do you see this thing playing out?
Oh, I think absolutely it's the first scenario. I think people are fed up. I really do. The working people of this country are fed up. The middle class especially. I mean, even the poor welfare user, even some of them, believe it or not, are hard workers. They just don't make enough money, and that's why we shouldn't be bringing more of them in from not just the Middle East, but Central America and Mexico. If you can't afford to feed your family, we shouldn't be bringing you here.
Right.
We shouldn't have to supplement your income, even though you're a hard worker. You're not making enough money to pay for your 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, or 8 kids. Your mouths to feed. You have to be able, like you said, when your ancestors came here whenever that was, they didn't come with their hand out. They had to work and support 100% of their lifestyle. And it was the same with mine, okay? Well, so number one is people are fed up with having to subsidize these lifestyles of people coming here who lack the skills to provide sufficiently for their family.
Right.
And so I think that was part of the Trump phenomenon that you saw. It wasn't racist. Right. It wasn't xenophobic.
No, I understand that, yeah.
It's a pocketbook issue.
Right.
People are tired of having to foot the bill for others and then having to see their own income decline and their own standard of living decline. And we've seen the declining standard of living for the middle class now for really since the 1980s.
Yeah. Well, we at one point had the largest middle class in the world.
Right.
Now, compared to the other industrialized nations, we have the smallest middle class in the world. And that's where all the pressure is.
Yes.
When jobs are so scant that if someone applies for a job, I mean a low-level job that requires no education whatsoever, the person who gets the job is someone with a college education. I mean, this is how bad things have become. There's going to be this come to Jesus meeting. It's going to come to an end, excuse the expression, but something's going to happen. There's going to be a trigger event where it's going to unravel absolutely everything. Now, every time I say that at a business meeting, or I mention the fact that I don't think we can do this because we can't afford it, what do I get? Oh, you're such a negative person. And I think to myself, I'm the only positive person here. I'm the only one thinking. Everybody else is numbnuts. They're brain dead, so they're happy. Make me brain dead. I'll be laughing all day long. It doesn't mean I'm going to survive. And it seems that we don't have this. We got this idiocracy attitude, mentality in our brains that we are no longer able to think or connect the dots. That's what scares the heck out of me. And in my humble opinion, the only way this thing will rectify itself is if we had an economic calamity in the United States. And I don't mean a downturn, a recession. I mean a calamity, like a currency crisis like you've never seen before. Then people are going to say, hey, I better hold on to what I have. I better not go into debt. I'm not going to buy that new car with no money down for 2 years, with 7 years to pay at 0% interest, provided I make the payments in advance, and plus they'll pay for my old car that's underwater. We're not going to see that anymore. All this insanity has got to stop. And in that insanity is this immigration issue. It's all a monetary issue again. We're back to the same situation again. You can't afford to pay for the car that you just was sold, and neither can we afford to have these people come in under these false pretenses. Something's got to give. How do you think it's going to play out? Just give me your wild, and if you're wrong, we're going to charge you $50. I want you to know, but go ahead. I'm only kidding. How do you think this is going to play out?
I'm not any economic expert, Joe, but I am a little worried about the transfer of power coming up. Because if you look at the economy over the last 8 years, it's not been great, but it's been propped up by what? Funny money.
That's
the
right.
Federal Reserve printing money, lowering interest rates to below zero in some cases. I mean, it's insane. But so we've had a false stimulus to keep the economy of chugging along, even at a slow rate.
Right.
Now we have a new president coming in who is not liked by the establishment, to say the least. He's anti-establishment. We've seen how much they hate him, and that scares me. Does that mean the Federal Reserve is going to stop? And they could, like you say, not even ease. I think we do need to ease interest rates up some, because it's to bring the money supply more in balance with reality, and our spending limits in balance with reality, our spending practices in balance. However, if they do it too quickly and raise interest rates quickly to say, like under the days of Jimmy Carter, I think we could be in real trouble economically.
Oh, absolutely. If we raise our interest rates to 4 or 5%, under Reagan it was 21%. 21%. Right. We cannot raise it 1/4 of 1%. And the main reason, what the Federal Reserve won't tell you, they give you all this gobbledygook, is the fact that if we raise the interest rates, we can't afford the interest on the interest rate. All of our revenue will go to interest. That's why it's zero, basically, because we can't afford to pay it. And anyway, I'll go on that scenario for an hour and I'll probably have a heart attack, and then you'll be responsible for it. But Leo, I want to we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for being on our program, folks. This is Leo Hohmann. He's the author of the book, and you've got to read this book: Stealth Invasion: Muslim Conquest Through Immigration and Resettlement Jihad. I want to thank you so much for being on our program, and I do hope that you will accept that invitation to return at a later date and give us an update, and hopefully we're still around and kicking.
Amen. You've got an amazing show here, and you're an amazing host. I've really enjoyed it, Joe.
Oh, thank you so much for those kind words. The check's in the mail. Thank you, Leo. Folks, this is
Take care.
Folks, this is to the end of today's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, as my wife would say, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano, America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly talk radio. Stay well, stay tuned.